Well, this wasn't published until the year 2000. So everybody that wrote before didn't have access to that. Now, did it turn the apple cart upside down? No, it didn't. But there was valuable material that changed part of the interpretation. For a long time, Lincoln was really not getting his due as a lawyer. But in reality, he was one of the greatest lawyers in Illinois. And it was, as Donald said, tremendous preparation for what he did in the rest of his life. Do you think his career as a lawyer helped him in the Lincoln-Douglas debates? Wow, you know, because in a sense, there's quite a bit of debate that goes on in the courtroom in front of a jury. Well, that's not all either. This guy, Michael Burlingame, who I just mentioned, a professor emeritus at Connecticut College, I remember hearing him speak 10 years ago, and he was talking about doing a new biography. And at that time, I'm saying, yeah, another biography. And he said there's going to be a lot of new material. Well, he was digging it up. And what he was doing was really researching all of Lincoln's secretaries. And Lincoln had 4 of them. And here's an example, a book that's entitled Lincoln's Journalist, John Hay's Anonymous Writings for the Press, 1860 to 1864. He had done so much research on John Hay and John Nicolay and Noah Brooks that he was able to discern that a whole bunch of anonymous pieces that were written during the Civil War were written by Lincoln's secretary. And he concludes that some of what John Hay was getting in there anonymously was probably written by Abraham Lincoln. And he concludes that these 2 secretaries, being so close to Lincoln and with him so often, really almost were a mouthpiece. In other words, they understood what Lincoln's attitudes were that he was saying with no press around, making notes and so forth. And so it becomes a valuable new source, something that had been passed over all this time. Who's this guy writing? He's John Hay that's writing all this. And Burlingame then has come out with several books that you'll see that are all on this topic of what these secretaries were writing. And I'm sure that when we read his new book, we're going to see lots of reference. Well, what's the evolution of opinion in terms of what's the best single volume to read a biography of Lincoln? For a long, long time, it was a book written by Benjamin Thomas. He was the executive secretary of the Abraham Lincoln Association. The book came out in 1952. Highly regarded book, still highly regarded, but it was the book that everybody would say, if you're going to read one book, read Benjamin Thomas. Then comes along Stephen Oates, and he's a professor at the University of Massachusetts in a book called With Malice Toward None. Just a great book, and now historians are saying this is the best biography, but terribly, Stephen Oates really has been taken down a notch because researchers have said that he plagiarized portions of it. And the guy who was leading the Lincoln Legal Project was a guy named Cullum Davis, and he was the first whistleblower. It's a great book. If he did not give credit a few times, don't discount the book. That's something that's a bad deal if that's actually the case. And of course, we don't have jury trials and decide that. It's other people's opinion. But I would highly recommend it. Now, David Donald, 1995, the book simply titled Lincoln is considered the very best. And as I mentioned, James McPherson says that Ron White's book, A. Lincoln, is going to supersede it because he's got new material, and I assume he's thinking about Burlingame's research. What are the best multi-volume books? I've already mentioned Nicolay and Hay, the 10 volumes, 1890. On the list was Albert Beveridge. He wrote 2 volumes, and it deals only with Lincoln's early life. But they're highly regarded, published in 1828. Early 2-volume work done by William Barton. He was a Congregationalist minister, was not a trained historian. Carl Sandburg, even though he gets jabbed and criticized that sometimes he hadn't done his adequate enough research. Of course, Sandburg was a poet and wrote with great eloquence. And, you know, history is really a combination of science and art. Scientific in terms of its exploration, and an art form and how you express it. And of course, if you take Carl Sandburg, he's going to tip much more to how he writes and not so good maybe on his research. And he probably wasn't as scrutinizing as he should have been about some of his sources. It was a good story, so I'm going to write it in there. And as you know, in the classroom, you have to teach it, but you have to tell a good story to really excite students, and the same way with books. And for a long time, the best books written by scholars were only read by other graduate students. The general public did not read that stuff coming out of the academy. But today, even the best scholars really know how to write, and they tell a great story. But Sandburg won the Pulitzer Prize for his 4-volume Lincoln. And then there's a new guy out, and I don't know anything about him other than he's not an academic. Richard Lawrence Miller, two volumes, Lincoln and His World, The Early Years. Second volume, Lincoln and His World, The Prairie Politician, takes him through 1942, which tells me he's going to write a multi-volume. I bought the 2 volumes. I'm going to be reading it, and I'm going to be talking to some real scholars to see what they think. Well, Lincoln has been dissected so many times that we now have books on many of his speeches. He did a significant speech at Peoria in 1854. Brand new book came out last year on that. He made a speech in Bloomington that none of the reporters apparently were so enamored with Lincoln's speech that they didn't take notes. And so it's called The Lost Speech. But there is a book entitled Lincoln's Lost Speech that was written in 1856. Then I've referenced his speech at Cooper Union. That speech was given in 1860 in February in New York. Harold Holzer's book, great book. There are 2 different books written on the second inaugural. Ron White has written one, and there are several books written about the Gettysburg Address. Doesn't that tell you something? You're a famous American, but now they're writing more than one book about one speech. I'm hoping one of you will write a book about this speech I'm giving today. I'll be so pleased. Another way to appreciate the literature is don't forget the journals. The Lincoln Journal is the journal of the Abraham Lincoln Association, and if I recall right, this association was created in 1908. So any association that hangs in that long says a lot about the interest in it, and there's really some good stuff. The Lincoln Herald comes out of Lincoln Memorial University in Tennessee. Would recommend both of these. And another way is to look at who's on the editorial board. And you'll once again see those major scholars giving credibility, because they're not going to select some article that's slipshod and publish it in. Well, now let's talk about revisionist history and who are the biggest detractors of Abraham Lincoln. And I can see that I've got about 11 minutes, so if I talk fast, it'll be for that purpose. The first guy who really took on Abraham Lincoln was Edgar Lee Masters in a book called Lincoln the Man, published in 1931. I don't know if you know that name, but Edgar Lee Masters was from Illinois. He was a poet himself. He's famous for something called the Spoon River Anthology. And he really decided to knock Lincoln off his pedestal. And here's part of what he wrote. And he really starts out criticizing the Gettysburg Address. Now, that takes some guts, right? But he did. He said the Gettysburg oration remains a prose poem, but in the inferior sense that one must not inquire into its truth. And he goes on to talk about the untruths in the Gettysburg Address. It's untrue that our fathers in 1776 had brought forth a new nation, for in that year our fathers brought forth 13 new nations, each of which was a sovereign state. Sounds like John C. Calhoun and states' rights. Therefore, the war was not testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated could long endure. Lincoln dared not face the facts at Gettysburg. He had so long duped his own mind with the falsely formed judgments of his early and inadequate thinking and reading that he was unable to deal realistically with the history of his country. Okay? I won't keep going, but that gives you a little flavor. And I might add, his book didn't sell real well.